So I've had a lot of time to watch Netflix and movies during this whole pandemic thing. And I don't know about you guys, but yeah, just have had a lot of time. And something I've realized because I've gotten a lot of, and I've asked for a lot of recommendations from friends and family as far as what movies to be watching and what series, TV series, whatever, Netflix series to be getting into. But I realized that not everything everybody recommends is for me. And one thing that draws me in and kind of connects me to a series or a movie and makes me want to invest the time is how much I get attached to the characters, good or bad, evil or good, whatever. And the way that I've noticed that a lot of shows do that is that they help us kind of feel for them and have this compassion, this empathy for the characters, be emotionally invested in our TV shows. That makes us care about what happens in the end, what's the outcome going to be, whatever. It helps us to like them more. And one of the ways that shows, movies do this, they help us to emotionally connect, draw us in, is when they start to show parts of a character's life that kind of happened before the current situation. And it can be called like a backstory, a flashback. It's a way to let us know that we've arrived somewhere, but we don't know the whole story. And this happens in the Marvel movies, X-Men, Harry Potter, where throughout the series, different parts of the movies you get, they kind of give you, they pull back the veil and give you a picture of kind of the bigger picture, what's happening, how complicated things are. And they might show you kind of how the hero and the villain, they used to be friends and now they're not. And it gets you wondering like what happened that could have like taken two friends and now they're going to try and kill each other. Or they give you insight maybe into a character that's not so likable, whether it's a villain or not. They give you insight into kind of why they are the way they are. And that happened for me in the Harry Potter series when they started to reveal more about Severus Snape. And once they started kind of revealing his backstory, I became way more emotionally invested in him as a character. And I've even found myself in those moments at times kind of rooting for the bad guy. I don't know if you guys have ever, if that's happened to you, but I just begin to realize so much of the backstory, so much of what's happened. I feel compassion for them. And then there's a part of me that like doesn't want them to lose, even though they're the bad guy. But my point is that understanding the backstory helps for me take a story that could be very simple. Like if you kind of think about the basic themes of some shows and movies, they're very simplistic, but it takes it and it makes it complicated and compelling, and it just makes it interesting and keeps me watching. But sometimes when they do this backstory thing, when they have flashbacks, they can seem super random. Especially the first couple times it happens because you don't know what's coming, and then they flash back and you don't know if they're flashing back in time or if they're actually looking at totally new characters. You just don't know. And in those moments, it makes us ask these questions like, what is going on? What is happening? What is the point of this? What does it have to do with anything? And I think what's interesting is that there actually are moments in our lives that make us ask those same exact questions. I would even point to this current COVID situation as one of those moments where I've asked myself multiple times, like, what is happening? What does this have to do with anything? Like, how is this even real life right now? And whether or not that's been your experience with COVID, maybe COVID has not made you ask those questions, like, what is happening here? But I do think that we've all had times in our life, whether they're painful, confusing, chaotic, not understanding, whatever, that cause us to ask this question, like, why is this happening right now? What does this have to do with anything? And we know that we're living through our backstory, right? Like someday these things are going to be part of our backstory. Coronavirus, the pandemic, the quarantine of 2020, like these are all going to be parts of history, part of our backstory that we've lived through. But when we go through painful, hard situations, in the moment, it's rough. And so we've been in this series asking this question, what to do when you don't know what to do? And which brings us to tonight, like what to do when you're living through COVID-19 and life stops for weeks on end, and there's seasons of our lives that are going to end very differently than how we expected. Or what to do when your parents' divorce is impacting you a lot more than you thought it would. Or what to do when somebody you love gets sick or even dies. Or what to do when that relationship ends, whether it's a boyfriend or girlfriend or friendship, and it just hurts. Or what to do when your learning disability makes everything just a little bit harder and you need so much more perseverance to hang in there, right? What to do when life is hard. What to do when it does not go the way that we expected it to do. In other words, the heavy stuff, the painful stuff, the real life stuff, the stuff like in movies that makes us connect to characters, but the stuff that in our own lives is just hard. And a lot of times when these things happen, we end up asking ourselves these questions. I've asked myself these questions. Why? Why is this happening to me? Why am I going through this? Why is this happening now? And I know for like a lot of our seniors, a lot of our kids that play sports, I've talked about this, those of you that have been in music and band, and basically just any student out there who has a life outside of the four walls of your house, you might be asking yourself right now, like, why is this happening right now in this season of my life? And the ways that it's impacting you are hard. And just like in a movie, when it flashes back to the scene that doesn't make any sense in the moment, difficulties can make us feel the same way. Like they can feel random and pointless or totally unnecessary. And sometimes, if we're lucky, after the fact, we might end up seeing the point of it. Like maybe when a friendship breaks, right? And a few months out, like during it, it's hard and it hurts, or a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship breaks, whatever. And it's hard during it, but a few months later, you look back and you realize that maybe that was a toxic friendship that wasn't good for you anyway. And so it ends up working out. Or maybe your parents or a teacher is really just riding you because you're not doing well in school. But maybe that has to do with the fact that you've totally checked out. And so that painful confrontation, reminder, whatever, of them saying, hey, like you've got to get it together, is the catalyst that helps you kind of reinvest and get your grades up, or, get re-engaged with the school year. And so it's nice when that happens, when you kind of can look back and be like, well, that was painful, but I see the point of it. But sometimes that's not what happens. We ask ourselves, why me, when we go through hard things, and sometimes there's just no answers. And what's worse, in real life, unlike in the movies, our difficulties and our circumstances don't like get resolved and tied in a nice little bow at the end of it. Like the outcome might not be what we want it to be. And in those times, it can be very difficult to see how there's a point to any of our pain. But what I hope we walk away with tonight by looking at the life of Joseph is that that's not necessarily true, that we can find hope and determination to keep going even when things don't make sense. So we're going to review kind of where we've been. I hope you guys appreciate, maybe you don't, but I had a lot of time and I thought maybe a visual would help. But yeah, so let's just review where we've been in Joseph's life, right? So he started at home, right? He lived with his father. This represents the colorful coat. He was his father's favorite child. And he had dreams, and he told his brothers about his dreams, which irritated them. And so they sold him into slavery. And he got sold into slavery, moved to Egypt, ended up working for this really powerful guy. Jason talked about that last week. And Potiphar. So he was decent story right here happening. But then Potiphar's wife found him attractive and came on to him, and Joseph was kind of in this lose-lose situation where he didn't want to dishonor himself, Potiphar's wife, or Potiphar, but the wife was kind of like demanding that she come into the bedroom. And so over time, eventually she accused him of something that he did not do, and he ended up in prison. which is where we're going to pick up the story today. So Joseph is in prison for a crime he did not commit. And while he's there, he ends up making 2 friends. And that's the part of Joseph's story we're going to read. So I'm going to pick up, let me just find it here. I'm reading out of NIV, and this is in Genesis 40. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his 2 officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. So basically what happens is Pharaoh is the king, he's in charge of everything, and if you do anything that irritates him or whatever, he has the right to throw you in jail, and even if it's not illegal. And that's what happened with these 2 guys, is they had irritated the king, he throws them in prison. So after they had been in custody for some time, each of the 2 men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream on the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So just pause here for a second. I want to point out this fact that even though Joseph was in a circumstance that was pretty awful, I would be angry, confused, frustrated if I was in prison for something I hadn't done. He still, given this opportunity, gives honor to God, which is pretty incredible. So what happens next is the men tell Joseph their dreams, and he interprets them with God's help. And what's really interesting is they have very different outcomes. So the chief cupbearer, Joseph said that his dream meant he would be restored to a favorable position in the king's kingdom, and it actually happened. And the chief baker, Joseph said his dream meant that he would not, and that's exactly what happened. He was not restored. And so the rest of the story, if you read the rest of in Genesis 40, what happens, it's pretty cool. So I would encourage you to look that up tonight or tomorrow and finish that out, but it is really worth a read. So you might think that soon after the cupbearer gets out, like that's going to change Joseph's story, right? Because he just interpreted these dreams for these guys and they came true. And now the cupbearer is back in Pharaoh's kind of good graces. And so, of course, he's going to speak kindnesses and flattery about Joseph to Pharaoh. Well, that is not what happened. It took a full 2 years for the cupbearer to even mention Joseph to Pharaoh. And so, right, Joseph interprets these dreams. These 2 guys get released from prison. And I just wonder, right, if there were not moments where Joseph was sitting there like, what is going on? Like, why is this happening? When is this going to be over? And I can relate to that. But fast forward 2 years later, Pharaoh started having dreams that were really unsettling. And eventually, dun, 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 that is when the cupbearer remembered Joseph and was like, hey, there was this guy in prison that knew how to interpret dreams. And actually, he interpreted that I would be restored and maybe you should talk to him, right? So Pharaoh summons Joseph. Joseph ends up interpreting Pharaoh's dreams. And this leads to Joseph being put in charge of all of Egypt. So, right, Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt and ends up being Pharaoh's like right-hand man. And because of Joseph's leadership, what's even more awesome is that all of Egypt ends up being able to be prepared for a famine that was coming. And they did not perish. It did not impact them negatively. And not only that, but they were able to serve the people, the people that where Joseph came from, right? So Joseph's brothers and his father ended up coming and being able to survive this famine because of Joseph's leadership in Egypt. That is amazing. That's an amazing, amazing outcome. But what's kind of crazy is that even once Joseph was promoted to this position of power, it wasn't like he had nothing to worry about anymore. It didn't make everything perfect. He was still serving Pharaoh. And if we remember from the cupbearer and the baker, at any point, if Joseph did anything to irritate Pharaoh, he could be thrown back in prison and it would all go away, right? And so all the good things that happen in Joseph's life, like being the right hand to Pharaoh and preventing an entire country and nation from going into famine and being devastated, it still didn't make the bad things go away that he had experienced. And it still didn't necessarily protect him and give him the outcome that he would want, right? Like things could still have gone wrong. But I think when we take a step back and we look at the story of Joseph's life, what we can walk away with and see is that all the things that Joseph went through, all the hardship and the heartaches, it was preparing him. His challenging circumstances were preparing him and positioning Joseph for something great. Joseph was being prepared for something only he could do, right? And so, dun, dun, dun. You know, Joseph interpreted dreams his whole life. His dream interpreting is what got him in trouble in the first place. But God is in the business of redeeming our stories. And so all these things that happened to Joseph in his life, God was able to be there on the other side and use them and position Joseph for a purpose, an amazing purpose. And students, I think the truth is, I know the truth is that the same is true. The same principle that happened in Joseph's life and his story is true for us. And it's important to remember, because here's the thing. When bad things happen, it doesn't mean that it's something that God is doing to us. That's not true at all. Bad things happen, circumstances happen, people are hurt one another because of sin. Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery because of sin. But we also serve a God who is in the business of redeeming our pain. And actually, there's a verse in Romans, that talks about this. It says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." That's in Romans 8:28. And it may not seem to make things better. It may not even make sense yet, right? Like the circumstances you're walking through, they're so painful. But God is in the business of redeeming our hurt, of redeeming the difficult things that we've walked through in our lives. And so I want us to remember this for tonight. When we don't know what to do, remember that your problems can position you for a purpose. Your problems, student, the difficulties that you face, their backstory that you have, those flashbacks are going to be a part of a future where you're positioned to make a difference. And that doesn't mean that we have to walk away and tie a bow on everything bad that's ever happened. I mean, in Joseph's story, there was still pain and forgiveness and all sorts of things that had to happen in his relationship with his brothers. Again, he was serving the Pharaoh, and so at any point, this dream situation could be over. But we don't find our confidence in our circumstances. What Joseph's story teaches us is that we can find confidence in our God, in our God's ability to redeem all of our circumstances and position us to make a difference. So when we go through pain, I think there's two things that if we remember them, they can kind of help give us perspective. The first is this, that no one else has your life story. Even though the difficult things that you have walked through, are walking through, will walk through, are not fun, they are unique to you. And they put you in a position to learn and grow and discover things that nobody else can. And the second thing is, I want you to remember that your story can impact others. That as God kind of redeems your painful situations, your painful circumstances, he will position you uniquely to love and serve others. Maybe there are other, in your future, right, you'll come across other students or other people that have struggled with a learning disability or have divorced parents or gone through a really negative relationship in a friendship or a dating relationship, or survived having a parent pass away and die. Whatever the painful circumstance that you are walking through or have walked through, God can use to grow your heart of compassion and love to be able to serve others around you that have walked through similar things. And so I want to leave you with this. Joseph went through pain that felt pointless. It was frustrating. I can't even imagine. But when we take a step back and look at the backstory, we see that God used his problems to position him for a purpose. God took the impossibly bad situation that Joseph was in and created this unimaginable good for him down the road. And I just want you to imagine, what if he could do the same for you?